Hello and welcome to the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority's second Discovering Coyote Valley webinar. My name is Nick Perry and I'm the Coyote Valley Project Manager with the Authority. Today's webinar is all about the past, present, and future of Coyote Valley's natural and working landscape. For those of you who joined us at last week's webinar, thank you for joining us again. And for those who are joining for the first time, a bit of a quick introduction to Coyote Valley. So at last week's webinar, we heard a lot about our local wildlife and how Coyote Valley serves as an essential landscape linkage. It is one of the few places left where wildlife can travel between the 1.1 million acres of habitat in our local mountain ranges. The valley floor itself is home to incredibly valuable wildlife habitat like wetlands, creeks, and meadows, and is also home to rich agricultural lands, critically important water resources, culturally significant sites, and great opportunities for expanded public access to open space. Since 2019, the Authority and its partners, the Peninsula Open Space Trust, and the City of San Jose have conserved nearly 1,400 acres of land in North and Mid Coyote Valley. These conserved lands are highlighted in green with gold outlines on this image. The long-term image is to protect Coyote Valley for all forever, and the upcoming master planning process will provide opportunities for communities to work together to create a roadmap for the future of these protected lands. I'll be talking more about the master plan at next week's webinar, but this week we are focusing on the concept of stewardship and how we can best care for Coyote Valley's rich resources. To help kick things off today, we have a welcoming message from Andrea Mackenzie, General Manager of the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority.
Hello, my name is Andrea Mackenzie, and I'm the General Manager of the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority. I'm excited for today's webinar that's all about honoring the past, present, and future stewards of Coyote Valley. So thank you for joining us. Right here, between the Santa Cruz Mountains and the Diablo Range in South San Jose, lies the stunning Coyote Valley, our top conservation priority. Here we're working with partners such as the Peninsula Open Space Trust, the City of San Jose, and many other agencies and organizations to realize a greener future for these lands. For thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of Coyote Valley were stewards of this landscape and still live in the region today. In fact, multiple local tribal groups recognize Coyote Valley as part of their traditional territory. For millennia, our tribal partners were responsible stewards of what we now call Coyote Valley. And today, their strong stewardship ethic and respecting the land and all its natural inhabitants continues. Though we are just beginning the process of engaging our tribal partners about the sustainable stewardship of Coyote Valley, we look forward to integrating their knowledge into our work. As we begin developing a comprehensive vision for this increasingly protected landscape, it's important to remember that these lands were not always protected, and some still aren't. For over 40 years, Coyote Valley had been considered one of the most threatened landscapes in California and the nation. Countless advocates, including Green Foothills, Greenbelt Alliance, and the Audubon Society have fought for its protection. Thanks to those efforts and the work of many others, we can now start thinking about how to shape this landscape in a way that will be forever here for the benefit of nature and people. As we work on writing a new and greener chapter for Coyote Valley, one that preserves natural and working lands and nature's contributions to people, we need your help. Through the Coyote Valley Conservation Areas Master Plan, you can help inform how we can restore this vital connection of people and place in Coyote Valley while supporting this vibrant ecosystem for years to come. As the master planning process gets underway this fall, we hope you'll get engaged. We want to hear from you, your voices, your stories, your hopes for the future of Coyote Valley for all. These webinars are just the beginning of many important opportunities to engage and learn more about the future of Coyote Valley. Thank you again for joining in today.
During her remarks, Andrea mentioned how Coyote Valley is part of important ancestral lands for the indigenous peoples who have stewarded the land for millennia and still reside in the region. And it's my honor today to introduce two leaders of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area, Tribal Chairwoman Charlene Nishimi and Vice Chairwoman Monica Arellano as our webinar's first speakers. Thank you, Chairwoman Nijmeh and Vice Chairman Arellano for joining us here today.
Hoshituhi, Kanakraka, Monica Villariano, Huachuscuchush, Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, San Francisco Bay Area. Good day. I am Monica Villariano. I am the Vice Chairwoman for the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. I will be reading our Muwekma Ohlone Tribal Land Acknowledgement. Muwekma Ohlone Ware. Hoshituhi. We would like to acknowledge that while we gather for the Santa Clara Valley Open Space Authority's Discovering Coyote Valley Webinar 2, the past, present, and future stewards of Coyote Valley within the counties of Santa Clara and Santa Cruz, we are gathered within the ethno-historic tribal territory of the intermarried Matatlan, Damian, Ohlone-speaking tribal groups, who include the direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. The present-day Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, with an enrolled Bureau of Indian Affairs documented membership of over 600 members, is comprised of all the known surviving Indian lineages aboriginal to the San Francisco Bay region who trace our tribe's ancestry through the missions Santa Clara, San Jose, and San Francisco during the advent of the Hispano-European Empire into Alta California beginning in AD 1769. The enrolled Muwekma tribal families are the legal successors and living members of the sovereign, historic, previously federally recognized Verona Band of Alameda County, now formally recognized as the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. Muwekma means la gente, the people, in our traditional Chochenyo Ohlone language. The land on which Coyote Valley is established was and continues to be of great importance and significance for our Muwekma Ohlone tribal people. This region extends to surrounding areas that held several tupentocks, traditional semi-subterranean spiritual roundhouses, which were once located within our ancestral Thamian Ohlone-speaking tribal villages in this valley. Tupentocks were places of healing, rituals, dances, intertribal trade feasts, celebration, and religious ceremonies. Nearby, many ancestral heritage shell mound sites served as our tribe's territorial monuments and traditional cemetery sites, constructed as earth mounds for high lineage families, craft specialists, and fallen warriors. The region surrounding the county of Santa Clara, where Coyote Valley is located, is where many of our ancestral heritage cemetery and village sites are located. These localities are viewed as special and sacred places, and we respectfully acknowledge that they have been previously settled and controlled by our ancestral Muwekma tribal groups for many thousands of years. Today, our Muwekma Ohlone tribal leadership and members work as stewards for many of our 10,000-year-old ancestral heritage village and cemetery sites, such as the IBM site, CASCL 62, the deeply stratified site, CASCL 178, going back almost 10,000 years at Metcalf Road and Highway 101. The Three Wolves site, CASCL 732, that our tribe named Kapan Hunitma by Highway 101 and 85 interchange. And at the 8,000-year-old at Murphy Springs site, CASCL 671, which we have named Huntak Ganak Dak, meaning place of the ancient spring site. Coyote Valley, known as Mayan Wai in our Chochenyo Tamian language, is within our ethno-historic and intermarried Matatlan Thamian Ohlone-speaking tribal territories in Santa Clara County, which, based upon the 18 unratified federal treaties of 1851 to 1852, include the unceded ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. Some of the enrolled Muwekma lineages are descended from direct ancestors from the intermarried Thamian tribal groups, whose ancestors had affiliation with missions Santa Clara, San Jose, and San Francisco. It is important that we not only recognize the history of the land of the intermarried Matatlan Thamian Ohlone-speaking tribal region on which we gather to participate, learn, and honor, but also recognize that the first people of this region, Muwekma, or Muwekma Ohlone people, are alive and thriving members of the greater Santa Clara and broader Bay Area communities today. Even though our tribe was denied a land base due to the gross negligence of derelict BIA officials after we were first federally recognized in 1906. It is because of the tenacity and strength of our ancestors and elders that our people have been able to maintain our identity and traditions and keep our culture and language alive. Furthermore, our Muwekma Ohlone families have never left our indigenous ancestral lands. Today, we repair the sustained damages of over 251 years of colonization. We are focused on keeping our traditional culture strong while we work for a bright and favorable future for our children as we follow in the footsteps of our ancestors. We respectfully request that the citizens of Santa Clara County and surrounding towns strive to be good stewards on behalf of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe by maintaining the bay, fresh waterways, native plants, animal habitats, and the air we all breathe. Furthermore, we request that the counties of Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, and surrounding towns honor the military services of the Muwekma men and women who have served honorably overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United States Armed Forces today, and honor the tribal veterans and service members from California, North and South America who have served this country with dignity and honor. In closing, it is of great importance to acknowledge the significance of Horseware, beautiful land to the indigenous Muwekma Ohlone people of this region. We ask everyone who visits Coyote Valley, Santa Clara County, Santa Cruz County, and surrounding towns to be respectful of these Aboriginal lands and natural habitats within our traditional homeland. And consistent with our principles of community, inclusion, and diversity, strive to be good stewards on behalf of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe on whose land you are guests. Makishhorshe makinan utashbut makam makiwe. We thank you, and on behalf of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe, we hope that you celebrate, honor, and stand in solidarity with all Indigenous people with their struggles to reverse the adverse colonial legacies affecting all people of color in Santa Clara County, Santa Cruz County, the Greater Bay Area, California, the United States, and the Americas, as we gather and reflect on the sacred lands of the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe. Aho. Thank you.
Horshe Tuhi, good day. My name is Charlene Nishimi, and I'm the chairwoman for the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. I would like to thank Open Space Authority for inviting us to be on this panel today. The Muwekma Ohlone Tribe has been working for the last 40 years to receive federal recognition, but the tribe has always been working to be recognized locally in places like Coyote Valley and with organizations like the Open Space Authority. And what do we mean by local recognition and why that is so important to us? Our people were taken by force from many of the villages in the Bay Area to the missions, San Jose, Santa Clara, and Dolores. The Muwekma Ohlone Tribe today represents 600 direct descendants from a distinct tribal band that was identified back in 1906, living on the lands owned by Phoebe Hearst. This was in the Sunol area in the East Bay, around Mission San Jose. And since our people lived near the Verona Railroad Station, a federal agent labeled us the Verona Band. That name, Verona, really is a perfect example of how little the federal government cared about the treatment and welfare of the California Indians who just survived a genocide so horrific, it wiped out over 97% of our population. We barely survived the destruction of our villages, the enslavement of our people, the diseases, the homelessness, the theft of our children, and the bounties on our heads. And after all that, when Congress in 1906, 1914, and 1927 mandated land be purchased for the destitute homeless Indians of California, one federal agent, without visiting us, without interviewing us, without asking the locals, labeled us as the Verona Band. The tribe had long been called many things depending on the context. The Mission San Jose Tribe, Band or Indians, the Pleasanton Indians, the local Ohlone Indians, or the local tribe or Indians. what the tribe was never called by anyone outside of the Indian Agency. And they only did this so for a few years, was the Verona Band. To the contrary, historians, linguists, local non-Indians, and tribal members continue to use the various names above, which had been used throughout our history. That label they gave us, Verona Band, is why we need to educate the people about our history, who we were, where we came from, and why the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe isn't recognized today. Not only did they misname us, name our tribe, but they also decided to take us off the list of tribes to receive land and left us landless, living and working on other people's lands just to survive. They tried to erase us. That disregard for our welfare and our identity continues today. The government refuses to restore our status as a federally recognized tribe, even though they admit we were federally recognized and never terminated. Tribal nations ceded millions of acres of land that made the United States what it is today, and in return received the guarantee of ongoing self-government on their own lands. But in the case of Muwekma, the government broke that guarantee. They erased us because we were living on valuable real estate. First, they found gold. Then came the tech companies making our land too valuable to give up. The truth is that our ancestors have inhabited these lands for 10,000 years, and we never understood the concept of land ownership. Land gave us life, and we were entrusted to protect the land for future generations. When our tribe formally organized in the 80s in order to make our voices heard, it wasn't celebrated by the community of the Bay Area. People did not want to accept us as the tribe of this area. Academics, cities, archaeologists denied us the rights that we have as sovereign people. That is what I mean by local recognition. We often say to people, we are still here and we never left. We call this the politics of erasure, and we deal with this every day. But we did have some rights as the descendants of the first peoples of these lands that couldn't be ignored. When the construction projects in the Bay Area would encounter the burial grounds of our ancestors, our tribe had to be notified as the most likely descendant. Through the work of reburials, we documented and researched our past and asserted our connection to our ancestors. And one of these sites is right here in Coyote Valley by the IBM buildings. Our ancestors, the Matalan, Tammy, and Ohlone, lived here. Today, we are still fighting for federal recognition in Washington, D.C., but we need local support and local partnerships. We need your voices to amplify our voices. We need your voices to let the federal government know that we do have the support of our communities and that justice matters now more than ever. Our people have been without land for more than 200 plus years. We have been disconnected from the knowledge that the plants and animals give us. So we are grateful to be included in the planning and the planning around Coyote Valley and to form this partnership with the Open Space Authority. Our goal in the years ahead is to reconnect with the land by gathering, tending, farming, and being together as a people on our ancestral homelands. Thank you again for the opportunity to share a piece of our history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Nijmeh and Vice Chairwoman Arellano, for sharing your tribe's story with us. As a product of local schools, you learn about the missions, you learn about Californios, and that history has just been so forgotten and glossed over. And I just really appreciate you both coming here today and taking the time to share it with all of us. It's important for all of us to remember that Coyote Valley, like the rest of the Bay Area, is a landscape that's been cared for and stewarded for thousands of years by our local tribes. And we look forward to working together with the tribes as we plan Coyote Valley's future. As we face the challenges brought on by climate change, carefully stewarding and managing our natural resources will become even more critical. And our current drought reminds us that this is especially true for our water resources. In just a few minutes, I'll be introducing two speakers who are joining us today to help us understand the past, present, and future of Coyote Valley's unique water resources. But before I introduce them, we're going to try to do a quick poll. So I'm going to see if that can get loaded up. Right, so we want you to tell us, Coyote Valley is home to many unique water resources, and which one are you most interested in learning about today or in the future? So go ahead and we'll have that open for about 30 seconds. All right, let's see what results we have. Okay, so folks are most interested, it looks like, in learning more about Laguna Seca, followed by the Coyote Valley's groundwater, followed by floodplains, Coyote Creek, and then last but not least, Fisher Creek. So great, we will try to talk a lot about Laguna Seca and those other areas as well. So as I mentioned, the next presentation is going to talk about water resources in Coyote Valley and how open spaces like Coyote Valley serve as essential natural infrastructure to increase our community's resilience to the effects of climate change. So here to speak to us today about all things water in Coyote Valley is Zooey Diggory, who is a biologist and wetland specialist at Valley Water, and Jake Smith, Conservation GIS, Geographic Information Systems Coordinator here at the Open Space Authority. While Zooey and Jake are presenting, feel free to pop questions into the Zoom Q&A feature. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can after the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jake and Zooey.
Hi, this is Zooey. It looks like I can't turn on my video, so I'm gonna have to wait for some open space folks to, there we go, here we go. Thank you, hi. Good morning. Thanks, Nick, for that introduction. I am Zooey Diggory. I'm with Valley Water, and we are Santa Clara County's wholesale water supplier, also your flood protection district, and we help to steward our watershed lands. And I am deeply honored to be a part of this panel and to work in this really special place. So today, Jake and I are going to take you on an exploration of Coyote Creek's watershed and how the landscape that we know today has been shaped by water resources. And then we'll end with the opportunities that we now have to restore the vital functions of water resources in Coyote Valley. So I'm going to start by introducing a few key terms and processes related to water resources. I want to help set the stage for Jake's focus on the Coyote Valley. And I also want to help you feel more informed and empowered to engage in the Coyote Valley Conservation Area's master planning process. There's a lot of technical terms, but they don't need to be scary or intimidating. So hopefully we'll cover some of those today. So next slide, please. So this is an example of the historical conditions in the Coyote Creek watershed, of which Coyote Valley is a relatively small part, actually. It's a big watershed. So the watershed is all of the land, the Santa Cruz Mountains, the Diablo Range, and the valley floor that send rainfall into Coyote Creek, into our groundwater basin, and eventually out to San Francisco Bay and the Pacific Ocean. In our watershed, rainfall hits the ground and flows over the hills and valley floor to create stream channels and floodplains. And these are referred to as runoff. The forests and the grasslands and other vegetation communities help to slow and filter that runoff and prevent erosion, which results in clean water, which is referred to as water quality. So I think I've got a couple arrows here. If someone can, there we go. So there's our hills and our runoff into our creeks. During winter storms, creeks would overflow onto very wide floodplains. And this slowed the water down, which is referred to as flood attenuation. And it deposited the fertile soils that created what became referred to as the Valley of Heart's Delight. That runoff also filtered into the groundwater basin or aquifer. And that's a process referred to as groundwater recharge. And I've got another arrow there to point that out. Thank you. This process also helps to clean and filter our water. And at one point, there was so much groundwater in some areas, such as Coyote Valley, that there were abundant freshwater wetlands, which we'll learn more about with the Laguna Seca. And at the Baylands, that groundwater was helping to keep salt water from intruding into our groundwater basin. Over time, habitats adapted to how this water was moving across the landscape, creating oak woodlands, grasslands, freshwater wetlands, and forests along our creeks. And this natural system was variable and dynamic, but it was also self-sustaining. There were wet years, there were periods of drought, the rivers would flood, some would run dry, and these variations created a diversity of habitats and an abundance of resources for wildlife and humans. And these resources were resilient. They could withstand and recover from droughts and from floods. So next slide, please. As you might imagine, our watershed has been significantly changed. First cleared for agriculture, much of our valley floor has been paved. And with it, we lost some of our watershed's ability to filter and clean the water and for rainfall to make it into our groundwater table. Ditches were dug, creeks were straightened, and levees were built to control how water moved across the landscape. And we lost some of our watershed's ability to slow or attenuate those floodwaters. In addition, we've been pumping water from the aquifer, so much so that in the past, San Jose sank by about 13 feet. These changes, of course, have allowed us to build our communities and industries, but they also caused stream channels to erode, groundwater to drop, and our water quality to decline. So I've got a few arrows here to help point out some of these. That paving of our watershed, thank you, the straightening of our channels, and our groundwater wells and pumping. Okay, so for our next one, thank you. So to address these problems and help replace some of those natural functions and services that we lost in the watershed, we've now built and depend on a variety of infrastructure, which we refer to as built or gray infrastructure. So that includes our dams and reservoirs, which we have 10 of in our county. We've got 393 acres of groundwater recharge ponds, which help us get that water back into our groundwater table. And we've got about 100 miles of levees to protect our communities from flooding. So for your reference, our water supply infrastructure now, that includes our dams and reservoirs, our groundwater recharge ponds, pipelines, pumps, and treatment plants, has a replacement value of about $7 billion. Next slide, please. Now, don't want to leave you on a low note here. Despite those profound changes, our watersheds continue to provide services that are critical to our way of life. And we now refer to those as ecosystem services, natural capital, and natural infrastructure. And natural infrastructure, such as our natural areas and our farmlands, provide open space and trails for a healthy lifestyle. They still help filter and clean our water. They produce food. They take up and store carbon. They still protect us from storms and floods, and they connect wildlife habitat. Our groundwater table, for example, stores more water than all 10 of our county reservoirs combined. And over a 100-year planning period, these services are valued in the county at $162 to $386 billion. So just as we invest in our built infrastructure to maintain its functions over time, we need to invest in and restore our natural infrastructure, which in addition to providing all of these benefits, also helps increase our resilience to climate change. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? This graphic illustrates a statewide strategy for doing just that, which is really putting water where it can do the most good and keeping it away from the areas where it can do harm. So in this example, our built infrastructure is still critical, right? We've got winter rains that are stored in the reservoirs at the top of the watershed. And we continue to have levees that protect our most vulnerable areas, our communities and our industries. But in this example, ditches and some of our levees have been modified so that natural areas and compatible or fallowed farmland are allowed to flood. And this will help recharge the groundwater table in certain settings. It's going to help slow down or attenuate our high flows. And it provides seasonally wet habitats for our wildlife. And I think as this figure really demonstrates, large undeveloped areas like Coyote Valley are important to implementing these kinds of strategies in the future, which are going to become even more important as our climate changes and cycles of drought challenge our water supply system. So with that, I hope you feel comfortable with some more technical terms, and I will hand the reins over to Jake for a closer look at Coyote Valley.
Great. Thanks, Zoe. So now that everyone has a big picture understanding of how people and watersheds influence each other and how we depend on our watersheds, I'd like to show how Coyote Valley provides critically important water resources benefits and how by protecting and restoring Coyote Valley, we can help our communities adapt to climate change. So as Zoe mentioned, Coyote Valley falls within the Coyote Creek watershed, and it covers about 10% of the Coyote Creek watershed. And you can see in this photo looking west over Coyote Valley, how much land we've been able to protect in this important landscape. Where its valley floor stretches from the city of Morgan Hill, located to the left of the screen, and the city of San Jose, located to the right. And it's defined by the Santa Cruz Mountains at the top of the page and the Diablo Range at the bottom of the page. And Coyote Creek and its tributary Fisher Creek are the two primary streams in the valley. And these creeks meet just at the right of the screen near that label that indicates Tulare Hill, where Coyote Creek then continues to flow north through urban San Jose and eventually into the San Francisco Bay. Next slide, please. Stepping back a little bit, Coyote Valley is a really unique area in the watershed. This map shows floodplains along the northern Santa Clara Valley, where the red areas show floodplains that have been urbanized or developed, where flooding can threaten life and property. And the blue areas indicate where floodwaters can fan out over the landscape without causing widespread damage. So you'll see that Coyote Valley, outlined in black, contains over 2,500 acres of open floodplains upstream of the Silicon Valley. Next slide. And these floodplains are really dynamic. The Open Space Authority has been working in close partnership with Valley Water to understand how water moves through the valley and how we can build back the landscape's health. We've developed this animation that shows how water flows through Coyote Valley and Fisher Creek when it floods. You'll see that these floodplains are not only vast, they also inundate different areas at different times, shrinking and swelling in response to the intensity of rainfall. So these floodplains allows the valley floor to act like a giant sponge that captures and holds water, not only reducing the severity of flooding downstream, but also sending more water into our soils and aquifer. So just give this a second to play out. All right, next slide. Can't get enough of that. And Coyote Valley is also an important area for aquifer recharge. The dotted green outline in this exhibit shows that Coyote Valley is a part of the same aquifer that supplies water to the Silicon Valley. And stippled green areas show undeveloped groundwater recharge areas, where Coyote Valley represents approximately half of the remaining recharge area in Silicon Valley's aquifer. So if these lands were developed and paved over like lands to the north, we'd have to construct more recharge ponds, levees, and dams to offset the loss of the benefits or ecosystem services that we get from Coyote Valley today. But we're actually hoping to take the landscape in the other direction, restoring it to allow for nature and wildlife to return, while also making our communities more resilient to climate change. Next slide. And we're using our understanding of how Coyote Valley functioned in the past to help shape its future. This map was created by the San Francisco Estuary Institute, showing what the valley floor looked like historically. You'll see the different colored areas indicate different habitat types, and the blue lines show where creeks flowed and then stopped as they fanned out over the landscape, kind of in the bottom section of the page. You can see that Coyote Valley was a vast network of very wet valley floor habitats centered around the Laguna Seca wetland, shown in blue in kind of the upper left portion of the page. Next slide. However, in the early 20th century, a series of ditches, shown by the blue dotted lines, were constructed to drain the valley floor. And dirt berms, also known as levees, shown by the red lines, were built up beside these ditches to prevent water from fanning out over the historic floodplain. And you can see that these ditches sent water directly into Coyote Creek, becoming what we call Fisher Creek today. Next slide. And more big changes were made in the early 2000s, where a dam and additional drainages were built to lay the groundwork for large-scale development in Coyote Valley. Fortunately, these lands were conserved before this was able to happen, and this infrastructure is no longer necessary today. Next slide. And we're lucky to have a lot of photographs of this work while it was being done. This photo was taken in 1916 and documents when the lowest lying point of the Laguna Seca wetland was tapped and drained by a steam-powered machine called a clamshell digger. You'll see a white line across the plants in the photo showing how deep the standing water was before it was drained. Next slide. And once the Laguna Seca was drained, it was burned, clearing most of the wetland and sending immense amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. Next slide. And all of this work had a huge impact on the landscape's ability to hold water. And this image shows that water that was once 5 feet above ground before reclamation was actually 2 feet below ground after the draining of the wetland. So these changes not only reduce the valley's ability to hold floodwater, it also dried the soils, making it harder for wetlands and riparian woodlands to survive. And so this slide shows where we are today. Looking over North Coyote Valley with San Jose in the background, you can see the network of constructed channels that make up Fisher Creek, the levees and dams shown in orange, making it harder for water to spread out from those channels, and the areas of land that still flood despite over a century of work to try to prevent it from happening. Next slide. So I want to close with these two pictures, contrasting Coyote Valley in 1916 and today, where so much has changed. And while we look to Coyote's past for clues on what we can bring back, we also need to think about what we need to do to prepare it for our new climate future. And this is where we're starting from with the Coyote Valley Conservation Areas Master Plan, where you get to help us figure out how we should restore Coyote Valley. And we're incredibly excited to begin this work through the master plan process and look forward to working with you all to figure out how to protect Coyote Valley so it can protect us. So with that, I want to thank you for listening and hope you enjoyed our presentation. And also thank Zooey so much for coming in and participating in this presentation as well. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Jake and Zooey. That was great. Really appreciate all that information. So we have one question that I want to ask you from a member of our audience. Said that Jake mentioned, this is from Brent, he said, Jake mentioned that a ditch digging created Fisher Creek, and that's fascinating. Will it be treated as a natural creek now? It's an important place for habitat and restoration. So any thoughts on the future of those ditches that you'd like to share?
Sure. The existing ditches have actually over time formed quite a bit of habitat, which is really valuable and important. And we're trying to weigh a lot of the trade-offs in between modifying those so it can restore the surrounding area versus the directly impacting those habitats. But what we want to do is try to find ways where we're not impacting those high value habitat areas that are there today that was created by the ditches, while also providing and restoring a lot of the functions that were lost, that frequent inundation of the surrounding area. So then those areas can start to evolve and kind of self-sustain themselves and lift up the larger landscape. So that's exactly the type of question that we're wrestling with and we'll be wrestling with through the conservation planning process.
So another question, more of a takeaway question, but how can Coyote Valley support us as droughts become more common?
Here, I'll jump in and Zooey, please add. But Coyote Valley is a big opportunity area because of the recharge area, and it gives us the space to be able to spread water out. So just like our reservoirs were constructed to capture winter rainfall and be able to save that for the summer, we're hoping that we can route water through Coyote Valley so it also better captures winter rainfall and puts it in the aquifer and slowly releases it into our creeks. So trying to figure out ways to slow and spread and recharge and wet our soils using the vast open spaces that are still there in the Coyote Valley.
Thanks. Yeah, I would just add, Nick, that Coyote Valley isn't the silver bullet for addressing our concerns and our challenges related to cycles of drought, but it's a great example of how we can take sort of better advantage of our winter rains, which, as we all know, are fairly fleeting, and let those be in the ground, sink in the ground, create habitat to help sustain us through our drier summers.
Great, thank you for those answers. So another question, how does Coyote Valley provide the community with clean water? Can you explain that function of the valley a little bit more?
Sure, I'll start. The more vegetation that our runoff, so all that rainfall and our creeks filter through, the cleaner the water in our creeks. And the more water that goes into our creeks goes into our groundwater table. And that groundwater table is pretty amazing at filtering out a lot of impurities in our water. Of course, it's also, a lot of us get our water from groundwater, so it's rich in minerals, and now you know why, because it comes from the ground. And But there's also a lot of things that get filtered out in that process that are not safe for us and not safe for our environment. So again, the longer that we can have water sitting on natural lands and slowing down, they're also less erosive, they pick up less dirt. So it's sort of a long-term water filtration process, not as quick and as efficient as our water treatment plants, of which we have several, but certainly a critically important function of the valley and of a lot of other natural lands that we have even farther up in the watershed that help to filter and slow water over time.
So another question we've got from the public is there's some recent land acquisitions that have happened up in the hills, like Tilton Ranch to the west of Coyote Valley. How do those kind of fit into the broader restoration picture for water resources?
So just jumping in, so Tilton Ranch is a hillside property and largely in its kind of natural condition. There hasn't been a ton of modifications there. So I think Tilton Ranch, one of the key strategies is keep what's working and try to also increase that landscape's ability to capture more water. And some of that is by maybe changing grazing regime so it allows the soils to capture more water. But that is one of the largest kind of sub watersheds within Coyote Valley and routes waters kind of that will be traveling through Fisher Creek and Laguna Seca. So keeping it in its natural form and trying to build on what's working is I think kind of the general idea.
Great, thanks. So another question, how will restoring the floodplain impact local agriculture?
It's a good question. It varies. So restoring the floodplain can actually improve the viability in agriculture with some lands that are impacted by flooding and by routing those floodwaters through restored habitats. So kind of the general concept that's being considered to apply to some of this is making the wet parts wetter and the dry parts drier. So by restoring creeks and floodplains, we can actually improve the viability of ag land. But when those big storm events happen, that agricultural land still provides room to be able to capture those big flood flows while we're also kind of routing water through restored habitats, like Zooey was saying, that will continue to treat and improve the water quality as well.
Yeah, and not sure that this would qualify with the crops that are grown in the Coyote Valley now, but there are some statewide examples, and that picture that I showed came from where there are certain crops that have been considered, more compatible with flooding, or they're seasonally flooded. All of that takes, very careful negotiations with the landowners and farmers, and in consideration of the growing season and the crop. But we do have some other examples in Santa Clara County where, and most of this I think is in the Paro watershed, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, where they're doing exactly what Jake said, which is the wet areas that have been problematic for farming in the past, that where your tractors are getting stuck and your crops are getting drowned, those are given over to the floodplain restoration elements, leaving the other farmland more productive and protected from flooding.
Great, thanks. So I think we have time for one more question. This is from Ronald Horry asking, what's the effect of the construction at Anderson Dam on groundwater recharge downstream while the reservoir is being drained?
Yeah, we have a pretty complex process right now of continuing to maintain the groundwater levels even during construction. So there is a lot of planning, a lot of negotiations going into how to get the water around our construction site and into the creek, so to keep the creek wet and to maintain our groundwater levels throughout the construction period. So an explanation of that is way beyond my qualifications and definitely more time than we have today, but it is a huge part of the planning of that project is to keep water in the creek and to maintain groundwater levels during that entire construction period. And after the project's completed, which I think it's important to remember that at the end, we're going to have this much more robust dam, but we're also going to have all the latest infrastructure in the dam that will really allow us to maximize how water gets used at that facility moving forward, both for groundwater, continued groundwater recharge, but also for the environment.
Wonderful. Thanks, Zoe. Well, we have lots of great questions coming in and some good comments too, and we'll try to get as many of those we can maybe towards the end of today's webinar. If not then via email. So stay tuned, and thank you everyone for participating and bringing those questions and keep them coming. But for now, I want to say thank you again to Jake and Zoe for sharing this information with us. Really appreciate your time and all the knowledge you've shared regarding water resources in Coyote Valley.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, guys.
All right. So next up, we have a message from County Supervisor Cindy Chavez regarding the importance of natural and working lands in Coyote Valley. We're going to queue up a video for you all to take a look at, and I'll be back shortly after then.
When I think about Coyote Valley, I think about Gilroy, I think about Morgan Hill and San Martin, and I think about this entire region. What I see is that the whole world has to be prepared to do two very important things right now. One is to deal with racial inequality and inequity in general, but the other is to do that while we're fighting climate change. And every community around the globe is going to need to find their way to be part of that solution. And Coyote Valley is our part of that solution. Part of it is that we're going to need to be able to grow food. And most places, and we learned this during COVID-19, you know, we've got some really fresh evidence that, you know, supply chains were at risk for a bit, and being able to grow your own food and be able to do that relatively close to where you have millions and millions of people living is part of the solution. The other is that Coyote Valley protects an aquifer of water. We're in a drought. And the ability to protect this water and to make sure it's available for generations to come only comes if we're conserving now, but also if we're planning in a way that protects those natural resources. The ag plan that the county has kicked off is really focused on how we protect and preserve agriculture. And you know, it's funny because for a lot of folks, they think of open space as in one bucket and agricultural land in an entirely different one. And I think what you can see even behind us is that one leads right up to the other, and that we've really got to focus our attention with much more discipline as to the expanded need of agricultural land, how we're going to make that agricultural land viable, and our partnership with open spaces, because really they're so closely connected. And the other thing is that it reflects really the needs of the community more broadly. I think for some people, they think the protection of open space is for those who like to hike or those who like nature, and that for those who want to protect agricultural land, that it's primarily a business, and you know, these are farmers who maybe don't care so much about open space. And I think what we understand is